George Harrison handed Eric Clapton a guitar in 1973 and said nothing. What followed wasn't a jam session, it was a duel. For 2 hours they played without speaking, fighting not with fists but with music, both channeling their pain over the same woman, Pattie Boyd. Everyone in the room could feel the tension. By the end, no one declared a winner, but those who watched knew Clapton had played with a calm control that George couldn't match. Their friendship, once deep and brotherly, had turned into something fragile and wounded. George's story began far from rock stardom. Born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house on Arnold Grove in Liverpool, he grew up in poverty. His father, Harold, worked as a bus conductor, and his mother, Louise, helped in a shop. Their small home had no garden and only a coal fire for warmth. Louise, while pregnant, often tuned the radio to Indian music, believing its soft rhythms would soothe her unborn child. Years later, those sounds would return to shape George's musical and spiritual life. In 1950, the Harrisons moved to a council house, and 6 years later, George's mother bought him his first guitar, a used Dutch Egmont. It was cheap, but to him it was everything. He learned a few simple songs and practiced endlessly. One day, while riding his bike, he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel on a radio and nearly crashed from excitement. That song changed everything. He wanted to be like Elvis, to live inside that sound. By 16, he left school and worked briefly as an apprentice electrician, but his heart was already set on music. He formed a small group called the Rebels and soon after joined John Lennon and Paul McCartney in what became the Beatles. In 1960, they traveled to Hamburg, Germany, to play in rough clubs, performing long, exhausting sets that hardened their sound. George was only 17 and too young to be there, so when his real age was discovered, he was deported. Still, the experience made him a real musician. 2 years later, in August 1962, the Beatles replaced drummer Pete Best with Ringo Starr and recorded Love Me Do. Within months, Beatlemania exploded. By 1963, George had written his first song, Don't Bother Me, while sick in a hotel room. Though it made the album, Lennon and McCartney dominated the songwriting, leaving him feeling overlooked. The band's touring schedule became brutal: 32 shows in 24 cities in barely a month. The pressure was immense, and George often said it nearly broke them. Then, in 1965, during the filming of Help, he discovered the sitar. That strange Indian instrument would reshape his creative path. With guidance from Ravi Shankar, he introduced it into Western pop for the first time on Norwegian Wood, opening a new musical world. But as his interest deepened in Indian spirituality, he began drifting from the rest of the band. By 1969, tensions boiled over. During the Get Back sessions, frustrated by Paul's control and John's detachment, George suddenly quit. He returned 5 days later, but the fracture never fully healed. Eric Clapton's beginnings were just as troubled. Born on March 30, 1945 in Surrey, he grew up believing his grandparents were his parents. His real mother, Patricia, was only 16 when she had him. His father, a Canadian soldier, left before Eric was born. When he discovered the truth at 9, it shattered him. Withdrawn and lonely, he found refuge in the guitar. At 15, he began practicing obsessively, teaching himself blues licks and recording his own playing on tape so he could improve. By 17, Clapton was performing in local pubs with a blues band called the Roosters. Later, he joined the Yardbirds, but when their hit For Your Love climbed the charts in 1965, he quit, angry that the band had abandoned pure blues for pop. That stubborn devotion to authenticity defined his career, but it also left him isolated. After brief stints in other bands, he joined forces with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker and Cream, forming rock's first supergroup. Their music was explosive, but behind the scenes the band was chaos. Bruce and Baker despised each other, often coming to blows. Clapton, trapped between them, turned to heroin to cope. By 1968, Cream collapsed under the weight of ego and addiction. Clapton was exhausted, broke, and spiritually empty. Yet that same year, George Harrison invited him to Abbey Road to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. No one outside the Beatles had ever played on their records before, but George insisted. Clapton's emotional solo transformed the song, earning quiet admiration from everyone present. It marked the beginning of a rare friendship built on mutual respect. Through the early 1970s, their bond deepened. Clapton played on George's All Things Must Pass album, while George joined Clapton's tour with Delaney and Bonnie. They stayed up late, drinking and playing until dawn, pushing each other musically. But their friendship would soon be tested by the woman who stood between them, Pattie Boyd, George's wife. George and Pattie had married in 1966. By then, fame had made their lives chaotic. During their trip to India in 1968, George began an affair, and their marriage started to crumble. Pattie tried to hold on, but he grew distant, alternating between deep meditation and cocaine-fueled parties. Into that fragile world stepped Eric Clapton, who had fallen hopelessly in love with her. In 1970, at a small gathering in George's home, Clapton confessed everything. Looking George in the eye, he said, "I have to tell you, man, I'm in love with your wife." The room froze. George demanded that Pattie choose. She stayed with him, loyal despite his affairs, but Clapton couldn't let go. He poured his obsession into letters and songs, most famously Layla, written in her honor. The song's desperate passion shattered her resolve. Meanwhile, George's own infidelity worsened. In 1973, Pattie discovered him in bed with Ringo Starr's wife Maureen. The scandal shook their inner circle. Ringo nearly divorced Maureen, and the Beatles' friendship splintered further. Heartbroken, Pattie turned to Eric. Their secret affair began that same year. George eventually found out, and the confrontation led to that unforgettable night when he silently handed Eric a guitar and challenged him to play. For 2 hours they faced each other, their pain echoing through the strings. George played with anger. Eric played with restraint. When the music ended, nothing more needed to be said. George knew what he had lost. By the end of 1974, George and Pattie separated. Their divorce was finalized in 1977. Eric and Pattie soon moved in together, marrying in 1979. To everyone's surprise, George attended the wedding, even joking that he and Eric were now husbands-in-law. Paul and Ringo joined the celebration, jamming together like old times. Despite everything, George chose forgiveness over bitterness. But Pattie and Eric's marriage was far from the romantic dream his songs had promised. Eric's drinking spiraled out of control. He became violent and unfaithful, having an affair that produced a child with another woman in 1986. The marriage collapsed 2 years later, leaving Pattie emotionally scarred. George and Eric slowly found their way back to friendship.